In my recent video about Bielefeld, I said this. This is the formerly separate town of Brackwede, which became a part of Bielefeld. And my pronunciation of this word may have confused some of you. Even many native German speakers might have expected me to say Brackwede, as would, I suspect, most non-native speakers of German who understand how German pronunciation normally works. But what I said was Brackwede, which is subtly different. And this kind of thing is repeated all over northern Germany, places like Mecklenburg, Lübeck and Brokel. What's going on? And already I can hear the sound of Germans writing comments to say that in northern Germany the letter C often lengthens a vowel. But this is actually not the case. In fact, it's all down to fashion. But to understand exactly what's going on, we're going to have to discuss vowels. When I was at school in the UK, I was taught that these are the vowels, and sometimes this is also a vowel. But that's actually not the case, because vowels are sounds, and letters are not sounds, they're basically shapes. One of the problems is that in our alphabet, which we stole from Latin, there just aren't enough letters to represent all the sounds in English. We have 5 letters to represent vowel sounds and 1 letter that sometimes represents a vowel sound, but in English we have about a dozen vowel sounds. I say about. The exact number of vowels varies quite a bit depending on the dialect that you speak. But whichever dialect of English you do speak, you have more sounds than letters. And these are only the monophthongs. There are also diphthongs, of which English has about half a dozen or so. What is a diphthong? Well, it's a vowel sound which changes into a different vowel sound as you are pronouncing it. So, for example, I. We can depict vowel sounds more accurately using the International Phonetic Alphabet. And these are the vowel sounds of standard British English. And of course, there's something similar for German as well. The standard German dialect has about 15 monophthongs and 4 or 5 diphthongs. Well, give or take. There are some vowel sounds that are disputed and some others that are so rare that they barely count at all. It depends on who you ask. Phonetics is a very complicated science. Now, I made a point of distinguishing between monophthongs and diphthongs for a reason. And that's because we're going to briefly talk about short vowels and long vowels, but we need to be very clear on exactly what we mean by that. Like many native speakers of English, I was taught that the vowel in hat is short and the vowel in hate is its corresponding long vowel. But that's not actually the case, because the corresponding long vowel would actually be ah. So we would have to say heart. A is not, as we were taught, the long version of a, it is a diphthong. And this is the result of something called the Great Vowel Shift. Starting around the 15th century, the long vowels of English started to change in a process that took several hundred years. And not only did the long vowels change, so heart became het, but in the south of England, they also changed into diphthongs, so het became hate. I say in the south of England, this didn't really affect dialects in northern parts of the British Isles quite so much, which is why in many dialects there, people still say het and hope. Those are still monophthongs.
What was the mouse one?
So I thought there was a ghost.
Ghost. It's been on for ages, that word, isn't it?
Say ghost by the coast.
There was a ghost by the coast.
The word ghost is haunting us.
But they are long monophthongs. And if your native language is American English, this is going to take a little explaining. Because while British English does distinguish between short vowels and long vowels, American English doesn't. Take these 2 words. I'm British, so I pronounce them sit and seat. Okay, obviously I'm exaggerating here, but you should be able to hear that seat is somewhat longer than sit. In the International Phonetic Alphabet, this is indicated by a symbol that looks like a colon. sit, seat. The standard American English dialect doesn't have long monophthongs like this, but you can still hear the difference between sit and seat because the vowel sound is very slightly different, as you can tell because the IPA uses a different symbol for it. For this reason, a lot of linguists will say that instead of talking about long and short vowels, it actually makes more sense in English to talk about tense and lax vowels. And in some, but not all dialects of English, tense vowels are longer than lax vowels. German also has tense and lax vowels, and they work in pretty much the same way. Compare, for example, words like bet and bet, or biete and bitter. But although a linguist might argue that they differ primarily in tenseness, a native speaker will usually perceive this as a difference in vowel length. In fact, there is one pair where, for most people, there is almost no difference at all in tenseness. This is the difference between Hase and Hasse. In any case, for the purposes of this video, it actually makes sense to go with popular perception and talk about long and short vowels. But if we have only these vowel letters to represent these vowel sounds, we probably need a way to distinguish between long vowels and short vowels. That would at least help, but how do we do that? The simple, logical solution would be to write the vowel letter twice to indicate a long vowel, and German does in fact do this. Sometimes. But instead of writing a double I, it writes IE. And the letters U and Y are never doubled, and neither are any of the umlauts, at least not in the standard dialect. But it can also signal vowel length by context. Now, the rules here are complicated, and there are lots of exceptions to these rules, but let's just focus on two of them. And by the way, these rules are also used by English. First, a long vowel can be indicated by writing an H after it, and in this case we can say that the letter H is being used as a lengthening character. This is pretty simple. It's the difference, for example, between fahren and fahren. Alternatively, a short vowel can be indicated by doubling the consonant after it. This is the difference between rate and ratte. The slight exception to this is the letter K, which in its doubled form is written CK. So, makel and makke, which coincidentally mean almost exactly the same thing. And this is why you would normally expect this to be pronounced Brackwede. And in fact, a lot of people do pronounce it that way, including even a lot of people who live in Bielefeld. Those in the know, however, pronounce it Brackwede. As I mentioned at the start of this video, this happens in a lot of place names, which happen to be in northern Germany. And so the assumption is that in Low German, the letter C is a lengthening character. Even journalist, translator and proofreader Bastian Sieg said so as he explained why his name is pronounced the way that it is. Except that this isn't the case at all. This all goes back to early modern High German, which was the form of German that was being spoken between the 14th and 17th centuries. In those days, spelling rules hadn't quite been fixed yet, and it became fashionable to write words with lots of extra letters in them without changing their pronunciation. This is called Letternhäufelung, a word that I think I'm going to translate as letter pile-up. As German transitioned into the modern version that we recognize today, most of these extra letters were removed. But they weren't always removed from people's surnames, which explains oddities like these. And they also weren't always removed from place names, which is how we ended up with Brackwede. But how come it's always northern place names that have these extra letters? Well, notice that I referred to early modern High German. In the low-lying regions near the coast, people spoke Low German, or at least they used to. But around this time, Low German started to become suppressed and replaced by High German. Low German place names like Lübeck tended to have lots of long vowels and single consonants, and so when High German spellings were imposed on them, they acquired a lot of extra consonants. And then, when people from other parts of Germany encountered these place names, they pronounced them with short vowels. And this resulted in a pronunciation which, to speakers of High German, simply felt more natural. Incidentally, in 1877, the state of Schleswig fought back. It decreed that place names that were being written with this suffix should revert to the original spellings and drop the extra C. And in 1946, the city of Hamburg followed suit. But in short, the reason Brackwede is spelled like this is because it had an extra C added to it for no particular reason. And you just had to watch this entire video to find that out. And in case you haven't seen it yet, here's my video about Bielefeld, a city whose inhabitants are sick of people telling them that it doesn't exist.